Well, g'day, and welcome back to another episode of the StoneX Australian Cattle and Beef Market Report. My name is Ripley Hutchinson. I'm the Australian Meats and Livestock Manager for StoneX based in Sydney, where we're developing price risk management tools for the Australian livestock industry to help the sector manage market and price volatility with our Australian feeder cattle forward contract. We're brought to you by StoneX Group, a Nasdaq-listed global financial services network with 100 years of experience in global commodity markets. Remember that the trading of derivatives, such as futures, options, and over-the-counter products or swaps, may not be suitable for all investors, and you should fully understand the risks prior to trading. Past results are not necessarily indicative of future results. Well, we're fortunate today to have Patrick Hutchinson join us. Pat's a director of Gibraltar Strategic Advisory and a previous CEO of 8 years for the Australian Meat Industry Council. Pat's been involved in the Australian red meat industry for 25 plus years. Really fortunate, mate, to have you on today. Thanks for joining us.
Mate, thank you very much. A very great pleasure to be here.
Before we get into the topics of today, first thing I'd like to touch on, fortunate to have you work alongside me here at StoneX in an advisory role, supporting the development and build out of our meats and livestock desk here, particularly obviously our feeder cattle forward contract and lamb in the future. Give us your views on what we're doing and its role in Australia's livestock industry and landscape here domestically.
Yeah, thanks, mate. Look, it's a pleasure and honour to be working with you on that. It's something that I'm very passionate about, all the way back to MLA's first opportunity that they saw with the Australian cattle futures, and how it's gone backwards and forwards up to today. It's an area that I've spoken about often because we're very good at managing production risk. We just have not been very good, or we've not really bothered in some areas of managing price risk. And I think that is to our detriment. Our competitors in the beef sector in the US, in Brazil, have been utilising these sorts of products for a long time now. And now what we're seeing on a global sense, on a geopolitical sense, is volatility, and volatility that is coming in continual waves. We've just, we're not long in the rearview mirror had COVID. Now we've got a scenario where, we've got someone who's not really working, I would say, to encourage the rest of the world in regards to having a peaceful time. And as such, that's having a flow-on effect in trade, and it continues to reverberate in trade. So with all of those things happening together with our own climatic supply cycles, and no doubt, we see your reports on issues in relation to weather. We know in certain parts of New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, South Australia, we've got some pretty dry spots that have occurred very quickly. All of that combination now is happening at once. Mm. And I think that has been something that has been tremendously rare for this industry to see those headwinds. So it's not a speculative tool anymore. This is about margin protection. And I think as we move forward, and it's been there for grains for a very long time, that the opportunity for us to utilise this product and in our, Australia's biggest agricultural industry is now. And I think, you and I would safely say that we certainly see that. We certainly see the rise of people wanting to learn more about the product, wanting to learn more about how to be involved and learn more about that price risk.
Mm. No, spot on. And I've really enjoyed working alongside you and appreciate having your input from an external perspective on what we're doing and provide a bit of direction. It's it's exciting. I think we'll get into today in the detail. Obviously, you gently touched on it a moment ago in terms of volatility. The big one's clearly the situation in the Middle East. Give us your views on how you think that's going to be affecting the exporters, processors, brands, that landscape end of the market for our listeners, and what do you think they're going to be looking at doing to adjust to this disruption?
Yeah, it's a fantastic point, because this is something now where we're seeing one event, for want of a better term, impacting on multiple different components. So it wasn't too long ago that we had oil at $100, yet we didn't have diesel at $3.20. So what we're seeing is that impact, not just about the price, but now it's supply. So when we've had oil spikes in the past, the clear thing has been about supply. And so that's where we're in this scenario now where getting access to shipping containers, container price, getting ourselves onto vessels, getting into the Middle East. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact it's a fairly lucrative market for not just beef, for other red meat products, as you've said, and other agricultural products. And it's a very high-level air freight business for us as well. So a lot of that's gone. That adds to that total carcass value. So when that gets starting to get chipped away, it puts processors especially under tremendous pressure, but it puts the whole supply chain in turn under tremendous pressure too. And it's not often that you would see a whole supply chain under similar pressure from one issue. We did see it during COVID, but we were able to manage it far more effectively. But I think overall what we've got is a scenario now where we've got increasing insurance based on shipping. We're seeing longer trade routes. We're seeing getting access is going to be more difficult. And then the reverberation of, $3.20, $3.50 diesel through the whole supply chain and everyone trying to utilize that, I think it's created a perfect storm. And as I said, at a time when climatic issues could start to work against us.
Yeah, it's that cost and that structural cost shock, I think, that's seemingly so pressing. I suppose you touched on it briefly at that exporter level. Do you think that with this Middle East accessibility to actually get product into that market, because of this disruption at the minute, do you see a long-term risk to our exporters potentially having market share competed away by the likes of the US or South American countries because of this disruption to access? Or is that not something you foresee as a longer-term structural risk?
Look, it's something that we'll probably talk about later, and in the same way as China, is that everyone's affected at the same time.
Yeah.
So we're seeing that oil price shock occurring, but then that supply. So, and the scenario that, throughout Asia, that's where our refining is now. So first access to the product, and then they're going to refine it and then give it to us. So that's why you've seen Albo wandering around Southeast Asia, shoring up deals that I think in some circumstances we already had. But anyway, and not only that, we're also now supplying them food, which we already were. However, I think that it's really about showing as well. And I think it shows as well for Australia that, for the rest of the world, they're going, well, there is a chink in the Australian red meat armour, and that is its access to fuel. So where others, certainly Brazil and the US, have probably easier access and easier opportunities and utilisation of ethanol and the like, we're not so lucky. So one of the other things I would say, and it will it will be part of what we talk about today, is geopolitics all of a sudden is not a shock anymore. It's now part of the system.
It's a constant.
Yeah, and it's then about how we manage it, and so it's almost like climatic and currency movements and other things like that. And that's what Trump and his administration has brought unfortunately, to the table. And we will see it as we progress forward into other markets, into other areas. And one of those is, obviously, it won't happen for some time, but the undercurrent of populism in the UK is a good example where that is becoming a growing market for us. But populism always leads to one thing, and we're even seeing it in our own domestic, is it also becomes protectionism. And so even though we might have an agreement and an FTA, as we can see with China, it doesn't stop from utilising that to underpin populist policy.
Yeah, and it's seemingly, at that geopolitical level, now every 6 to 12 months there's something else. We get over one conflict, or there's one issue stirred by geopolitics. Last year it was tariffs and the war between Gaza and Israel, and now all of a sudden we've got something else. It doesn't seem to be going away. And I think for a country such as ours, 70, 80%, 85% of what we produce in terms of red meat protein is exported. We're going to have to learn how to adapt to this pretty quickly because of our exposure.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. And my partners in the US, they are almost in a constant state of shock because they're fearful of going to bed because Trump doesn't sleep, and next minute something on Truth Social will pop up, and then they have to deal with it. And I think we've got to look at this for, as I said, from a more broader level. And beef can no longer just be the romantic notion of guys on the back of horses, mastering cattle and the like. This is a large agricultural traded commodity that Australia, it's our largest export to the US now, period. So now what we're seeing is that influence is growing exponentially, and we need to be a bigger voice. We need to be a bigger voice in our own government, in our own parliament, but we've got to be a bigger voice globally because we're also feeding nations as well. And the US all of a sudden now can't really do without us because we're supplying such a large amount of product. So relationship is also key as we progress through.
I suppose, and that's one of our biggest opportunities is people can't do without us, but also a big threat too, in the sense of how uncertain things are.
Yeah, and that's what I talk about, this rise of populism.
Yeah.
So it sounds great, and it's easy to talk about, and it's easy to have a vision on. But if we look at the way in which our EU FTA has gone, that is just underpinned by populist scenario with member states and their farming bodies. We're seeing it, as I said, in the UK with Farage. We're seeing it in the US. We're seeing it play out here.
Yeah.
And in a different tact via the thought of let's protect this. There's a huge amount of discussion around manufacturing in this country: Labor, Liberal, National, even One Nation. Yet they always seem to forget that the largest to second largest manufacturer in this country is red meat processing. But because we're an inverse manufacturer, we take a whole, we disassemble it, and we sell all the parts. It doesn't get the same traction. It should, because it employs 60,000 people plus. However, these are the sorts of areas, as I said, where that relationship, acknowledgement, understanding, and advocacy all play a very strong part.
100%. And I think it's a good segue into another very topical situation, which the sort of the media cycles move past quite quickly because there's 101 other things to talk about, but it is important for us as the red meat industry. Thoughts, reactions from the recently Indian free trade agreement?
Look, I think, obviously all of industry is very disappointed. There's some pushing back in those areas. I think it won't be the last you hear about it. 30,000 tonnes on beef that comes into effect over a 10-year period, which is glacial at best. So grain-fed access is somewhat constrained. There's in the text it talks about a 70-day grain-fed component, which actually isn't a feedlot at all. It's a feed bin in the paddock for 70 days. So tariffs don't add value. There's no two ways about it. But I think the EU is so ingrained in it, has been ingrained in it since it formed in the early 70s, that subsidized nature of what you can see. A number of us have, been to Ireland. We've driven around. We've seen the beautiful stone walls and the green grass and everything else. They're paid to do that. So sheep's almost on the side, beef's on the side of doing that, but they're paid to keep that component going. Now, that's fine. That's what it needs to be, but it needs to be recognised in that level, and that it distorts trade. But there's no meaningful outcome. But it's not an endpoint. It's it's a platform. There's a review clause in there, and I think that's where the real work does start now. And I think that what also the Trump administration is showing is that people are now starting to turn and look at different or stronger allies. And I think for that component, we need to be very mindful about how that plays out. With the EU FTA as well, I mean, look, there are things there that have played against us. I think the luxury car tax and it's not being removed certainly plays against us. Although, we do have a Japanese free trade agreement, a Korean free trade agreement, and JAFTA China. And there are luxury cars, or what's deemed as luxury cars, coming out of all three of those markets. So, yet we've got some fantastic we've obviously got great access there. So I think we've got to be looking at it, the EU task force, led by Andrew McDonald from Nippon and underpinned by, Mean Livestock Australia, as you and I both know, did a huge amount of work together with AMIC and others to get it to even to that point.
Yeah.
And it is a struggle. That being said, we do have a fantastic UK FTA.
Yep.
And I think that, those measures are there, but we must strive for getting as much access as we possibly can to underpin and recognise that total carcass value. And that's what we do. And, we will apologise to no one for doing that. And we will apologise to no one for then continuing to advocate for change or update as we see fit.
Yeah, and I think the point you raise is a really good one. It's probably not something at a production level here domestically we think about. You talk about carcass value and that increase in carcass value potentially through additional competition in export markets for our product can ultimately flow back here domestically. At a producer level, consider sometimes the premium those EU accredited producers will get at a feeder level, for example, simply because they've done that right thing at an accreditation level. And I think that's a really important way for the production side of the industry to think about it, is more free trade agreements, better access everywhere, gives more competition, which ultimately puts the industry in better stead right across the supply chain. Would you agree?
Look, absolutely. And the UCAS, that UCAS program, and way back, I think I was about as young as you, helped bring that in, and that was the first entree that we had into NLIS and green tail tags and green vendor decks and its own vendor deck and auditing by Osmead, but it's actually a federal government program. It's not an industry program. And so all of that different component met the need at the time, and it's been able to continue a strong, steady set of premiums. But look, it's difficult. It's not difficult, but it's an added work to maintain. And there are restrictions on it, so those premiums are justified in how they're provided. So I think that clearly what's the real bugbear is that the way in which our systems have been portrayed, the way in which areas like deforestation, animal welfare, all those areas out of the sustainability scenario have been portrayed. And I think we need to be, again, not just advocating to the EU about those credentials, but globally, because that's underpins what we do and how we do things, and it's a growing component of the verification of our of the way in which we produce beef.
And you mentioned it a minute ago, and I think it's probably not something that we as an industry are entirely clear on, but there is that clause within the FTA for the review. Give us a bit of, give us your view on where to next. That clause is there. Surely that's a positive sign. What does it look like?
Absolutely, and those clauses are always in FTAs, and remember that it also gives them the opportunity to make a call in relation to reviewing it just as much as it gives us the call. So it's like we should think about this as phase one. It's not the finished product. we can, we have that opportunity, but so do they. And no doubt they'd be walking forward with the luxury car tax scenario. Very interesting that, this government wants to play around with components in relation to capital gains or other sorts of scenarios which are, more broadly politically advantageous for them. Where at the same time they don't want to sort of go near or muck around with luxury car tax, which is probably $1 billion a year into the budget. So I think, this is where we've got to have that advocacy. We've got to be talking about that opportunity, and we've really got to be saying that other than putting money in the coffers, what is it actually doing? So, what's it? It's not enticing anybody for a local car industry because that's no longer here. So really, other than a cash grab, what's this about? So I think that there's sorts of scenarios there that we need to be looking at it from our own government. We're very quick to then go to the rest of the world and say, you're the bad guys. But, interestingly, there's a lot of areas from our own policy development and from our own structure that we probably should be also advocating on.
Yeah, and it's an important market and location to consider. And I think as you began this point about the EU, we're not going to hear the end of it. I think there's plenty more to come in that space. But the one I think probably other than the Middle East, particularly that's been most interesting and our trade publications here at a red meat level have stuck with a fair bit is this China situation. And you yourself, Pat, rode the China wave during your time as the CEO of AMIC, which was pretty manic, and obviously the loss of access for some of our exporters. A bit similar to my first question about the EU, what was your initial reaction to that announcement on 1st of January?
Oh, look, obviously it's guttering. I've had discussions. I'm the chair of the Australia China Business Council's Ag Forum. So, we've had discussions with the ambassador, et cetera, around this. Clearly, he's played, as you would imagine, cards very close to the chest, which is his right. And I think clearly this is something that is far more ingrained than we first imagined. It's not as simple as what it's being portrayed.
Yep.
This is something that is ingrained in the culture of China, and the fact that they want to see, or they think they're going to be able to get to this scenario of self-sufficiency. These are areas that aren't new to us. We've seen it in Indonesia often, where policy gets changed to reflect that, and then it gets changed later when people get hungry. But just to put it into numbers, we did 275,000 tons there last year. So we're only getting to 205 this year. It's not really a quota. Okay, so what it is that there's a sort of a protection mechanism within CHAFTA that's there, where we have a certain amount, and then it comes in free of tariff, and then it went to most favoured nation after that, which was only between 10 to 12%. So obviously, the similar thing is happening, as it is happening for every other beef importing nation going into China. But this time, once you get over your performance from the previous year, minus any other components, we're at 205,000 tons. So it's about then saying, well, we're going to have to, a potential diversion of 100,000 tons.
Yep.
So if we look at it from our commodity or our frozen beef, frozen trimmings, etc., obviously the US is just taking that up with gusto. So we're doing okay in that market, and we've got other markets that are taking up that sort of slack, such as Indonesia. It's when we come to our really high level sweet cuts, our primals, our grain fed primals, that it becomes it's becoming a bit more difficult and a bit more a larger exposure. We've got a few guys in there that have looking at it, and I know it was mentioned at the Australian Wagyu Association conference last week, that Wagyu component has certainly been growing over there. And so there's some brands and some smaller exporters that certainly have got a bigger exposure. So what does that look like? And I think, we represent just on 8% of China's imports. So it's the volume, not that's is of an issue really to us. Um, it's I guess we're not losing that market entirely, but it is about where do we move that other 100,000 tons, and then what components of that that we're going to move, how easy is it to move, and how difficult it is, but also are we going to then go into a quota sort of structure that we've had or we have with the EU and UK into the future? Who's going to handle that? How's it going to be managed? Does China actually care about how that gets managed, or are they just concerned about the amount that we put in on an annual basis? There's a lot to think about.
Yeah, it's pretty complex, and I think I'll stick with the comment you just make about the Wagyu end of the market and Angus as well. We've seen exporters really rush to get product out the door. They're pulling cattle out of feedlots early. There's been a real hurry to get that product in market, obviously, before we hit that safeguard limit or quota, however you want to call it. What I'd be interested, though, from your perspective and your experience in that market, what do you think there's going to be a shift when the Chinese consumer realizes they can't get the beef they want from us anymore because there's a lack of volume going in there? I'm not suggesting that exports to China are that high and stop completely, but it's a big consumer base for us. And from your view, what does it look like if those consumers suddenly wake up and realize they can't get that beef anymore from Australia? Will that make any shift at a governmental trade access level?
Yeah, last part first. I can't see that happening. The China bureaucracy and the China government, its relationship with the people is something that I think that we can't really try to pon too much on, because they may be making decisions they think are in the best, in the best respect for their people without actually asking their people. So it's also a scenario that we're looking at where we're filling, and it could be filled by the end of June, early July, the 205,000 tons. Now, we did 275 to the end of the year. Now, that would have included a component that was that would have been at that 10 to 12%. Because of the way in which the snapback or the protection mechanism occurs. So the change has been obviously that it goes to 55%, and really it's not that China is blocking product. It's just that it's made it so that it is just it's financially not feasible to send it. Now, if there was a scenario where people thought that the extra 55% they'd still pay it, we'd still send it. So So you're right. Everyone is rushing in because, commercial incentive always beats coordination. So, that scenario about people wanting to have a quota moving forward will still be there. But it's the thing that I've always said throughout my career, and I know people were getting sick of me saying it, but now it's almost come to fruition, and that is that you can diversify for volume, but you can't diversify for value. So China still matters.
Yes.
So I think what we've really then got to see is then what does the China market become? So is it a case that we were sending, say, for example, it was a 60-40 or a 65-35 frozen to chilled market? Do we see that chilled component increasing and the frozen one decreasing? The frozen can then be diversified to other markets. So in the end, we potentially still could see China being a higher volume market. We're just sending a higher volume of high value. Is that the way that we're going to change? You know that people are rushing product in there at the moment. That'll go into bonded storage, and then that will then leak out over the next 6 to 12 months at that price range, and then it will probably start again. So, look, it's going to be a fractured market for a little while people figure out what they need to do. Those sweet cuts, we've seen a bit go into the US, obviously into the Middle East, obviously into ASEAN, but again, not in larger proportions. And then what you then have is Japan and Korea. So Japan and Korea are looking at it from that point of view. Domestically here, we still want that leaner product. Over there, that's where these, the primals are going, short ribs, etc. And we're competing against the US and on that. into Japan. So we will be seeing, obviously, according to economics, a price differentiation there. So yeah, all of that stuff is still, there's a lot to go. There's a lot to go. There's a lot to see, is it going to change? Is China going to change? You can really depend on China changing. But so therefore what we need to do is look at, do we change the market mix?
Yes. And sort of jog my memory a little bit from your role with the Australia-China Business Council and engagements you've had with the Chinese side. You mentioned at the start, we as Australians probably don't entirely understand the relationship between government and consumer.
Yep.
Or the Chinese people. Well, it could be a couple of things, but in terms of how, what do you think the things are that we misunderstand about that relationship, which may have a role to play in terms of our exposure as a red meat industry to that market?
Yeah. For the most part, what we see when we look at these sort of interventions is that it's either a response to farming community saying, we think Australia is going to put too much product in here. And, there's even discussions and rumors going in the US around lamb. And that's been there before 25 years ago with the Clinton administration. I think that what we're now seeing is clearly that China is thinking about its farmers, and it's thinking about, how do we make ourselves more self-sufficient? This is not unique to just farming or beef. This is unique to everything in China. Their own industry, their own people, their own belief in their ability to be able to manage everything that they do. We got to remember that we are self-sufficient in beef and lamb. We are self-sufficient in grain. We're self-sufficient in a whole range of other things. And one of the biggest components that we've been speaking about even today, but certainly over the last 3 months, has been the fact that we used to be self-sufficient in a whole range of energy components that we're not now. So people, countries like China also look at that sort of component and then say, well, we don't want to be in that boat either. So it does play its part with us, and we need to be cognizant of that as a nation. And then we need to look at, okay, well then, is it going to be a scenario where we're actually going to be able to, inverted commas, wear them down, or to try to trade, quid pro quo, like Albo, as I said, has been doing in Southeast Asia on energy versus food? Or is it going to then be something where we think it's an immovable object, and then, like Australia always does, it finds a way to be able to manage it effectively well, and to then, and I hate using the old COVID term pivot, but pivot, in a way that is advantageous, and then we move forward. But that's what we do. That's how we do things here, because we have to as a trading nation.
Yeah, and I think, as you say, you can use the word pivot, but adapt. And I think you rightly point out, which I like to remind people, is the beef industry and the red meat supply chain more broadly, for that matter, does always find a way, and it does adapt. I just think we've got to be clear. And the comments you make about stuff like export mix between frozen and chilled, a great example that we, as probably the production end of the market, doesn't think about. How does the exporter go about utilizing the most of that access they currently have to a point? And maybe that's, more of the good stuff, and or the high value stuff, I should say, to increase the value of the carcass. And the other stuff can go into our American friends if they're willing to take more of it.
Absolutely, mate. And look, if we step back a little bit, it's Middle East, Europe, China, the US potentially, whoever that we're working with. The common theme is volatility and uncertainty. So you asked me at the start, and we talked about my involvement with StoneX and working with you. The key thing for me is that industry has got to start thinking differently about that risk pricing and alignment, because that's where we have the opportunities. As I said, our ability to be nimble, our ability to be able to reset, our ability to be able to not just adapt. Pivot is something where we denotes that we can do things quickly. Adapt is something that we do over time, and we do both of them well. So as I said, we manage production risk very, very well, better than most countries in the world. Now we're in this price risk scenario. Now we're seeing these things occurring and as components. So part of my discussions and my role with you is about the fact that we need to be making sure that we're not making rods for our own back. We're not working hard to try and get into different markets and do different things. And, the more that becomes not unstable, but the geopolitical scenario becomes more volatile, inevitably it's going to have an impact on beef. At the moment, beef's going strong. But once you then have currency risk, climatic risk, geopolitical risk all together, and you just don't look at the other risks, that's when that margin impact is going to occur. So, for the listeners, once again, shameless plug, but, I'm really passionate about this process because simply the fact that, we're going to have to be.
And I think it's, like you've been involved in the industry a long time, and obviously around before the Australian cattle futures contracts on the SFE. But it's interesting from a younger person's lens. This is my 6th year of my career. Price risk is just not a discussion that the beef industry has. It's not spoken about in trade publications, general conversations. It isn't something that's raised. It's also a structural shift I think we can make collectively to discuss it more. And I suppose, I think today's conversation focused much around geopolitics, volatility, and basically situations that none of us have control over. That discussion of volatility and what it means for the beef industry, doesn't matter where you are in the supply chain, is becoming increasingly important,
Mate, absolutely. Look, when I came into the industry, mid to late 90s, we were moving into sort of a Howard era, a Clinton era in the US. There was geopolitical areas across the world, obviously, desert. You're on the doorstep of Desert Storm 2. You've had issues around that like 9/11 and a whole range of other things that had impacts that changed the way in which we trade, that changed the way in which we could do things. But it wasn't all happening at once. So that's why we're seeing this scenario at the moment where there is a trade impact combined with a potential currency impact because the dollar's appreciating, as well as then seeing oil price at $90, $95 to $110 a barrel. But supply is also restricted, which is causing that huge risk and upshot, together with our second biggest market for beef, second to third, restricting supply. And so, some of the furor around the EU FTA outcome was the fact that release valve, potentially, which could have been there for the EU, was then not achieved. So I think that's why, as an industry, we are still quite gutted with the EU FTA, but it's not just about the opportunity for access. It's also about the fact that we didn't have the opportunity to have an opportunity for the diversification of high-level product that we're creating. I mean, and that's why we then have to look at, well, if we no longer have those outlet valves, what are the next things that we need to look at as an industry moving forward? And look, price risk is something that is there, and the management of that. And so I think that I can only, and obviously working with you, but these are the things that we need to be looking at as we progress forward, because we've still got 3 years of Trump, let alone and his administration, let alone what happens after that, let alone how long it would take to fix any of the issues that have been caused. We could be looking at, between 5 to 10 years. Then potentially, as I've already mentioned, with world politics. So the beef industry is now a tremendously mature operational industry within Australia that is our biggest agricultural value industry. And we now need to then look at it from that point of view. What does world politics look like? We have to have that conversation. We have to have a look at those things, and all of those things taken into consideration, we then have got to be making some pretty big decisions moving forward for the next 1, 3, 5 to 10 years.
Mate, 100%. That wraps it up from me today. Was there anything that we haven't picked up on that we've missed?
Geez, mate, no, God, I hope not, because although all I would say again is that the one clear component that the beef industry has done in my time, and a very well-known Southeast processor, family processor, told me that when they went to Beef Australia or Beef 88, and then was out at Gracemere looking at the cattle that were there for both judging and auction, and the sheer variability between those compared to going out at Beef Australia 24 and seeing the absolute consistency that was there. That's what's helped us. That's what set us apart globally. That's what people are envious of. So I can only just say to the producers, feedlotters and processors, together with our transporters and sale yards and stock agents throughout our industry, that work and that time period has been huge to us being able to manage these shocks at the moment. But with more coming and changes coming together with climatic, we have to take a different approach.
100%. Thanks for joining us today. Unreal to have you on. Yeah, appreciate you making the time.
Mate, always a pleasure. Thanks, mate.
And shout out to a listener from Peter from Auction Flower in Queensland. Peter sent me an email after we released the Brazilian episode, and he asked me to do an episode on global markets, volatility, the EU-Australian Free Trade Agreement, and that's what we're obviously addressing today. So, Peter, you've brought us this episode. Thank you for reaching out and doing that for us. Next time we're going to get back into markets. I'll examine the critical month of May, how it's shaping up for supply and prices, and what it's looking like. It's always our biggest month in the first half of the year supply wise. So there'll be a fair bit happening there with a few weather systems at play and this big volume of cattle that we've got coming at us once the north gets going. But as always, if today's episode's raised any questions, reach out and send me an email to ripley.atkinson@stonex.com, or record a voice note of yourself, where you're from and the question, and we'll get to answering it in the next episode. Feel free to share this with any of your mates or colleagues, and anyone interested. I think Pat's given us a really unique perspective today on his views on the market volatility and obviously global trade. The best thing for others to get access to it is to share it with them. And of course, if you're enjoying it, give it a follow. But thank you for listening. And until next time, take care. Cheers.